I never thought that being too good at my job would be the reason I got punished, but here I was, sitting across from my new manager, Richard Holloway, as he casually ripped apart the work arrangement that had kept me functioning for the past year. "I don't believe in special treatment," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "You'll start working regular hours like everyone else, 9 to 5. I felt my stomach drop. I had spent months proving that I could still be a top performer despite my injury. My previous manager and HR had agreed that coming in early and leaving early was the best solution. It let me avoid the worst of the rush hour commute, which was hell on my leg. But Richard hadn't even asked for details before making this decision. He just saw that I left earlier than him and decided it was unfair. "I have a medical reason for my schedule," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and it was approved by HR. He shrugged. "That was then, this is now. You're expected to be a team player." A team player, that was rich, coming from a man who had been in this office for less than a month and had already made it clear that he had no interest in getting to know us. He saw numbers, schedules, and authority. People were just pieces on a chessboard for him to move around. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to argue. I knew his type. The more you resisted, the more they dug in their heels. Instead, I inhaled slowly and said, "Understood." But in my head, I was already forming a plan. I had no choice but to follow his new rule, but I wasn't going to let him take advantage of me. I had been giving this company more than what was required, arriving early, staying late when needed, skipping lunch breaks to help with urgent projects. If Richard wanted me to work strict 9 to 5 hours, then that was exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time, around 7:15, but instead of logging in and getting to work as I always did, I took my time. I made coffee. I scrolled through my phone. I watched as my coworkers trickled in, some greeting me, some too tired to say anything. Normally, I would have started working long before the official clock-in time, but not today. At exactly 9, I logged into my computer and started my work. And at exactly 5 p.m., I shut everything down and stood up. "Hey, Sophie, can you take a quick look at this before you go?" My coworker Adam held up his laptop. "Sorry," I said, grabbing my bag. "My workday is over." He blinked. "Oh, okay." I walked toward the elevator, feeling Richard's eyes burning into my back. He was still in his office, probably expecting me to stay like I always had. I could almost hear the gears in his head turning. This was just the beginning. If he wanted to play this game, I was more than ready. The first week of my new schedule felt like an out-of-body experience. I had spent years being the reliable one, the person who was always willing to do a little extra to pick up the slack when things got chaotic. But now I was just another employee, clocking in and clocking out exactly when I was supposed to, and it was driving Richard Holloway insane. At first he tried to pretend he didn't notice, but by Wednesday, the tension in the office was undeniable. Every time I packed up my things at exactly 5 p.m., I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to slip back into my old habits. I didn't. I walked out of that office every evening without looking back. By Friday, he couldn't help himself. "Sophie, a word?" His voice was casual, but I knew better. I followed him into his office, closing the door behind me. He gestured to a chair, but I didn't sit. "I just wanted to check in," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've noticed you've been leaving right at 5 every day." "That's correct." I kept my expression neutral. "I have to say, it's a little disappointing." He folded his hands on the desk, watching me. "I thought you were more committed to this team." I exhaled through my nose, already anticipating where this was going. "I'm working the exact hours outlined in my contract, 8 hours a day, 1 hour lunch break, no more, no less." Richard sighed dramatically, as if I were being unreasonable. "Look, Sophie, I understand that the previous management allowed certain exceptions, but that's not how I run things. We're all expected to put in the effort. Sometimes that means staying a little later, making sure everything gets done." I tilted my head slightly. "So you're asking me to work overtime?" "Not exactly," he said quickly. "Just that you be flexible. You used to be one of the most dependable people here. What happened?" "What happened? My manager decided to change my schedule without consulting me, ignored my medical history, and expected me to continue giving more than what was required while disregarding the agreement I had with HR. That's what happened. But I didn't say any of that. I'm still dependable, I said evenly. You can rely on me to be here from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Anything beyond that would require a contract adjustment. Richard's jaw tightened for just a moment before he forced a thin smile. I see. Well, I suppose we'll have to make it work. I nodded once and walked out before he could say anything else. For the next few weeks, I stuck to my new routine religiously. I arrived at exactly 9 a.m. I took my full lunch break, something I had rarely done before, and when the clock hit 5 p.m., I was out the door, even if my inbox was still full. The work was getting done, but I wasn't doing anyone any favors anymore. It didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. Small things at first. Meetings scheduled at 4:45 p.m., expecting me to stay late. I would excuse myself at 5 on the dot, whether the meeting was over or not. Reports marked urgent landing in my inbox at 4:50, expecting me to scramble to finish them before I left. They waited until the next morning. One afternoon, Richard scheduled a last-minute team meeting at 4:55. I didn't even bring my laptop. As soon as my phone vibrated with the 5 reminder, I stood up and grabbed my bag. Sorry, I have to go, I said. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sophie, we're in the middle of something. My workday is over, I replied. His knuckles went white where they rested on the table. This is important. I looked around the room, noting the discomfort on my colleagues' faces. They all knew what was happening. Some of them I knew resented Richard just as much as I did, but weren't in a position to push back. I, on the other hand, was perfectly positioned to make this as painful for him as possible. Then I suggest we schedule it earlier next time, I said, and walked out. The next morning, Richard was waiting by my desk when I arrived. HR would like to speak with you. I raised an eyebrow but didn't react otherwise. All right. I followed him down the hall, suppressing the smirk threatening to tug at my lips. I had been expecting this. Inside the HR office, Linda Foster, our HR manager and one of Richard's allies, gestured for me to sit. Richard stood beside her, arms crossed, clearly expecting this to be some kind of intervention. Sophie, Linda began, we've received some concerns about your recent changes in work behavior. Richard tells us that you've been strictly adhering to the 9 to 5 schedule and refusing to accommodate reasonable flexibility. I leaned back in my chair, feigning confusion. I'm working the exact hours stated in my contract. I was under the impression that's what contracts are for. Richard exhaled sharply and Linda quickly stepped in. Of course, but in the past you've always been willing to go above and beyond. That's one of the reasons you were such a valued team member. So, I'm being disciplined for following my contract? I asked. Linda hesitated. Not disciplined, we just want to make sure there are no misunderstandings. We'd like to encourage a collaborative work environment. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it. I agree, collaboration is important. But my ability to collaborate doesn't require me to work outside of the hours I'm paid for. Richard's nostrils flared slightly, but he remained silent. Linda sighed. No one is forcing you to work overtime. We just hoped you'd be willing to support your team when needed. I smiled. I do, from 9 to 5. There was a long silence. Linda glanced at Richard, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I decided to make it easier for her. If you'd like to adjust my contract to reflect different expectations, I'd be happy to review any new terms, I said. Otherwise, I'll continue fulfilling my current agreement. Linda pressed her lips together, then finally nodded. All right, thank you, Sophie, you can go. I stood up, feeling Richard's eyes burning into me. I didn't need to look at him to know he was furious. This wasn't over, but for now, I had won this round. By the time the third week rolled around, the tension in the office had become unbearable. Richard Holloway wasn't just annoyed anymore, he was furious, and I could feel it in the way he hovered just a little too close when I was working, in the way his eyes flicked toward the clock every time I packed up my things at exactly 5 p.m. He'd been hoping that after my little HR meeting, I'd cave, that I'd get scared and fall back in line, but instead I had doubled down, making sure to follow every rule to the letter. If my contract said I worked from 9 to 5, then that was exactly what I did, not a minute more. The cracks in his patience started to show in small, petty ways, meetings scheduled deliberately late in the day, knowing I'd leave right on time, Reports labeled urgent but not actually needed until days later, landing on my desk 5 minutes before my shift ended. Even little things, like the way my access badge suddenly stopped working on certain doors, forcing me to take the long way around the office. He was testing me, trying to see where my breaking point was. But I had already broken once when he took away my original schedule. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing it happen again. On Wednesday, he pushed harder. "Sophie," he said as I walked past his office, stopping me with an overly polite tone. "A quick favor before you go?" I glanced at the clock. 4:57 p.m. "What do you need?" I asked, knowing exactly what he was trying to do. "It's just a small task, shouldn't take more than 20 minutes, he said with an easy smile, sliding a stack of papers toward me. I looked at the pile, at least 50 pages, all with sticky notes marking sections for review. I met his gaze. "I can take a look first thing tomorrow," I said, keeping my voice light. His smile thinned. "It really needs to be done today." I exhaled, pretending to consider it before shaking my head. "I'm off in 3 minutes, Richard. If you'd given it to me earlier, I'd have had time." His jaw clenched. "This is part of your job, Sophie. You don't get to just pick and choose when you work." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I do. My contract—" Yes, I know," he snapped, the fake charm vanishing. "You love bringing that up, don't you?" I stared at him for a long moment, then checked my watch. 5 p.m. I picked up my bag and walked out, leaving the stack of papers untouched on his desk. The next morning, the pile was still there, but now with a bright red sticky note attached. Urgent, complete immediately. I took my time settling in before starting on it, carefully reviewing every page at a normal, steady pace. By lunchtime, I had barely made a dent, and I wasn't rushing. If he wanted to waste my time with busy work, I'd make sure to do it thoroughly. By the afternoon, I noticed the way my coworkers were looking at me. Some were amused, others were nervous, waiting to see what Richard would do next. They weren't used to seeing anyone stand up to him. He had come in like a storm, enforcing rules just because he could, flexing his authority for the sake of it. Most people either adapted or left. I was doing neither. At 4:45, Richard hovered again. "Still not done?" I didn't look up. "Nope." He sighed dramatically. "You've been working on this all day. You asked me to be thorough." I heard his teeth grind. It was supposed to be a quick task. I finally looked up, feigning innocence. "Oh, I didn't realize you wanted it rushed. I assumed you wanted it done correctly." He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, and I knew I had struck a nerve. Before he could respond, I gathered the stack of half-reviewed papers, neatly aligned them, and placed them in a folder. "I'll continue first thing tomorrow," I said, standing up and grabbing my bag. 5 p.m. on the dot. Richard didn't respond as I walked past him. That night, I got a text from Adam. "Did you see your email?" I frowned and opened my laptop. Sitting in my inbox was an email from Richard, copied to the entire department. "Mandatory team meeting, tomorrow, 4:30 p.m., no exceptions." I smiled, so that was his next move. The next afternoon, I sat through an hour of nonsense. Richard droned on about productivity, about teamwork, about commitment to the company's success. I could feel the energy in the room sinking as the clock ticked closer to 5. At exactly 4:59, I placed my notebook down. At 5, I stood up. Richard stopped mid-sentence. "Sophie, where are you going?" I slung my bag over my shoulder. "My workday is over." He let out a breathless laugh, as if he couldn't believe I was actually doing this. "You're really just gonna leave? In the middle of a meeting?" I tilted my head. "You scheduled this knowing it would run past 5. "That's not my problem." The room was dead silent. I saw a few coworkers exchange glances, barely holding back smirks. Richard's face turned red, but he didn't say anything. I walked out, letting the door close behind me. This wasn't just about my schedule anymore. It was about showing him that he didn't control me. He could throw every petty move he had my way, but as long as I followed the rules, there was nothing he could do. And the best part? I could see it in his face. He knew it too. By the start of the 4th week, the atmosphere in the office had shifted. People weren't just watching my battle with Richard anymore, they were rooting for me. Every time I stood up at exactly 5 p.m., every time I ignored one of his late-day requests, I could feel the silent approval from my coworkers. Some were amused, others were impressed, and a few, I suspected, were considering following my lead. Richard, of course, was livid. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who was technically doing nothing wrong. He had expected me to fold the moment he started making my life harder, but instead, I had doubled down, and now every move he made was backfiring. So he changed his approach. If he couldn't force me to break the rules, he'd make sure my work life was as miserable as possible. On Monday, I walked into the office to find my desk moved. I had always sat near my team, close to the windows, where I could collaborate easily with the people I actually needed to work with. Now, my desk was shoved into the far corner of the office, right next to the break room and the noisy copy machines. I knew exactly what this was: a punishment, a way to isolate me. I took one look at my new workstation and calmly set my bag down. If he was expecting me to storm into his office and demand my old desk back, he was going to be disappointed. Instead, I pulled out my noise-canceling headphones, opened my laptop, and got to work. By noon, Adam and a few others had stopped by my new desk, shaking their heads. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "He moved you here?" I shrugged. Guess he didn't like how convenient my old spot was. Another coworker, Maria, lowered her voice. "You know he's hoping you'll complain, right? If you make a fuss, he can write you up for causing conflict." I smiled. "Then I won't complain." And I didn't. For the rest of the week, I acted like nothing had changed. Even when the copier jammed every 10 minutes. Even when people stomped in and out of the break room, slamming the door behind them. Even when Richard walked by multiple times a day, waiting for me to crack. I didn't. And by Friday, I knew I had won this round, because he was the one looking frustrated, but he wasn't done. The next attack came in the form of my workload. Suddenly, I was being assigned more projects than anyone else on the team. Tasks that weren't even in my usual scope of work, dumped onto my desk without warning. Some of them were clearly rushed: sloppy spreadsheets, half-completed reports, vague instructions that made it impossible to do my job efficiently. At 4:45 p.m. on Wednesday, Richard appeared at my desk, arms crossed. "I noticed you haven't finished the Miller report yet." I glanced at the document in question, a 50-page financial analysis that I had received only that morning. "Nope," I said. He narrowed his eyes. "That report is a priority. Then maybe you should have given it to me sooner." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I expect it on my desk first thing tomorrow." "I'll do my best," I said, fully aware that my best meant within my contracted hours. The next morning, I walked into the office at exactly 9 a.m. and continued working on the report at a normal, steady pace. At 4:59 p.m., it still wasn't finished. I closed my laptop, placed the unfinished document neatly on my desk, and left. Richard wasn't at his desk, but I had no doubt he'd see it first thing in the morning. Sure enough, the next day I found an email waiting for me, sent at 5:42 a.m. Subject: Urgent Miller Report. "Sophie, this report was due this morning. We can't afford delays like this. Please prioritize accordingly." I smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and responded. Subject: Urgent Miller Report. "Hi, Richard. I started the report as soon as it was assigned to me, but given its complexity, it required more time to complete. I will continue working on it during business hours today and ensure accuracy." At 5 p.m., it still wasn't done. By the time I arrived the next morning, Richard was waiting at my desk. "I need that report now," he said through gritted teeth. I picked up the half-finished document and held it out to him. "You can have it now, or I can finish it properly. Your call." His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he knew I had him. If he forced me to submit an incomplete report, he would be responsible for any errors. If he let me finish it, it wouldn't be ready until I was done. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "Finish it." I nodded and went back to work at my pace. The moment he walked away, Adam grinned at me from his desk. "You're killing him," he whispered. I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. I knew I was winning. But Richard was getting desperate. On Friday, I received an email from HR. Subject: Meeting request. "Sophie, we'd like to discuss recent concerns about team collaboration and work expectations. Please join us on Monday at 10 a.m. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. This was it. He was going all in, trying to get HR to force me back into submission. But if he thought I was going to back down now, he was dead wrong. I welcomed this meeting because I had something Richard didn't. Receipts. When I walked into the HR office on Monday morning, I already knew exactly how this was going to go. Richard sat across from me, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He had been waiting for this moment. He thought this was his chance to finally put me in my place. Linda Foster, the HR manager, gestured for me to sit. Sophie, thanks for coming in. We just wanted to have a conversation about some concerns that have been brought to our attention. I kept my expression calm. Of course. What concerns you? Linda folded her hands on the desk. Richard has expressed that your recent behavior has been disruptive. He feels that you're no longer demonstrating the same level of teamwork and flexibility that you used to. I didn't react. I let the silence hang for a moment before tilting my head slightly. Disruptive how? Richard leaned forward, seizing the opportunity. You refuse to stay for important meetings. You leave projects unfinished at the end of the day. You're actively resisting collaboration, Sophie. That's not the kind of attitude we want here. I let out a soft breath, then reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. I assumed this meeting was coming, so I brought some documentation of my own. Richard's face twitched slightly, but he didn't say anything. I opened the folder and slid a printed copy of my contract across the desk. As you can see, my contracted hours are from 9 to 5. That's the agreement I signed, and I've been following it exactly. Linda hesitated before nodding. That's true, but I cut her off with another document. Here's an email from Richard, time-stamped at 5:42 a.m., demanding work that wasn't assigned until the previous afternoon. Another paper, here's a request for an urgent report that wasn't actually needed for 3 days. Another, here's an email where Richard tried to schedule a mandatory meeting at 4:55 p.m., fully aware that it would run late. I leaned back, watching the two of them sift through the evidence. So if we're talking about disrupted behavior, let's be clear. I've been doing my job. I've been working my required hours. The only thing that's changed is that I'm no longer doing extra work that I'm not being paid for, and that's what Richard actually has a problem with. The silence in the room was thick. Richard's face had gone a deep shade of red. That's not what this is about, he snapped. It's about attitude. It's about setting an example for the rest of the team. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You mean setting an example that encourages unpaid overtime? That's not in my job description. Linda cleared her throat, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. Sophie, no one is asking you to work unpaid hours. We just want to make sure the team is functioning smoothly. I nodded. I agree. But that means fair expectations for everyone, right? Not just for me. She hesitated. Richard, on the other hand, was barely containing his frustration. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I turned to Linda. If there are new expectations for my role, I'd be happy to review an updated contract. But as it stands, I'm following company policy. If that's a problem, then maybe the problem isn't with me. Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. Richard, let's take a step back here. His jaw clenched, but he nodded stiffly. I think, Linda continued carefully, that maybe we need to reassess how workloads and meeting schedules are being handled. Sophie is right. She's following her contract. If we need her to take on additional responsibilities, that's something we need to address formally. I could feel the defeat rolling off Richard in waves. This wasn't how he expected this to go. He thought he could frame me as the problem, that HR would pressure me into backing down. Instead, he had just been reminded that everything he was doing was being documented. Linda turned to me. We'll review some options and follow up. In the meantime, just keep doing your work, Sophie. I nodded. That's exactly what I plan to do. I gathered my papers, stood up, and walked out of the office without another word. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed. A message from Adam. How bad was it? I smiled to myself as I typed back. For me, not bad at all. For Richard, it was only going to get worse. Richard Holloway was losing control, and he knew it. The moment I walked out of that HR meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. He had expected to walk away victorious, with me put firmly back in my place. Instead, he had been forced to sit there and listen as his own tactics were exposed for what they were: petty, retaliatory, and ultimately indefensible. He couldn't force me to stay late, he couldn't demand extra work without proper compensation, and most importantly, he couldn't twist HR into doing his dirty work for him. But Richard wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. If anything, the meeting had only made him more determined to make my life miserable. His next move was immediate. By Tuesday morning, I noticed a pattern. Projects that had nothing to do with my actual responsibilities started flooding my inbox. Tasks that should have gone to other team members were suddenly being redirected to me with vague instructions and impossible deadlines. It was an obvious attempt to overwhelm me, to make it look like I was falling behind. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what he was doing. So I did what I had always done. I documented everything. Each time I received a project that wasn't part of my assigned duties, I responded with a polite but direct email, CCing the necessary people. Hi, Richard. I noticed that this request falls under coworkers' area of expertise. Should I loop them in, or was this reassigned to me for a specific reason? I never accused, never complained. I just asked questions. And questions, when sent in writing, left a paper trail. Richard, of course, couldn't admit what he was doing. So each time he either ignored my email completely or tried to brush it off with a vague excuse. But my coworkers weren't blind. They saw the shift. They saw the projects stacking up on my desk that shouldn't have been mine. And some of them, quietly, started stepping in. On Thursday, Adam stopped by my desk. Hey, I saw that client file in your queue. That's my account. Not sure why Richard sent it to you, but I'll take it back. I gave him a knowing look. Appreciate it. The cracks were forming. Richard was trying to bury me under work, but instead he was making it obvious that he was reassigning tasks out of spite. And the more people noticed, the weaker his position became. Then, Friday happened. It started like any other day. I clocked in at exactly 9 a.m., took my full lunch break, and kept to my usual routine. Richard was unusually quiet, barely making an appearance in the office. I assumed he was regrouping, trying to come up with a new way to get under my skin. But just after 3 p.m., I got a Slack message from Maria. Holy shit, check your email now. I frowned and immediately opened my inbox. Sitting at the top was a company-wide email from upper management. Subject: policy review and workplace expectations. The message was short but brutal. Due to recent concerns regarding workload distribution, meeting scheduling, and adherence to contract hours, we will be conducting a full policy review. Effective immediately, all employees are required to track their assignments, meeting durations, and any work completed outside of their contracted hours. This data will be used to assess fairness in work expectations and ensure compliance with company policies. I read it twice, then a third time, and then it hit me. They weren't just looking at me, they were looking at him. Richard had pushed so hard, had played his game so openly that it had reached the higher-ups. And now, instead of punishing me, they were auditing him. I slowly leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding with satisfaction. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was a warning shot. The rest of the office was buzzing. I could hear hushed conversations, coworkers whispering to each other. Some were grinning, others looked nervous. But the one person I didn't see, Richard. He had disappeared from the floor. At exactly 5 p.m., I packed up my things and walked toward the elevator, my head high. I didn't need to see his reaction to know what was happening. Richard Holloway was running out of moves. By Monday morning, the office was different. The tension that had settled over us for the past few weeks had lifted, replaced by something lighter: anticipation. People weren't just whispering anymore, they were openly speculating, because Richard Holloway was nowhere to be seen. I settled into my desk, logged in, and casually scrolled through my inbox. No passive-aggressive emails, no last-minute urgent requests, no manufactured crises waiting for me. It was quiet. Peaceful, even. Then, at 10:15 a.m., an email landed in everyone's inbox. Subject: organizational changes. The message was brief. Effective immediately, Richard Holloway would be transitioning into a new role within the company. No details, no farewell message, just a vague announcement that he was moving on to new opportunities. I stared at the screen, barely resisting the urge to laugh. A transition. That was corporate speak for, we're pushing him out, but not publicly firing him. It was the same move companies pulled when they wanted to save face, when they wanted someone gone without making a scene. I turned to Adam, who was already grinning. So, we won? Oh, we definitely won, he said. I heard from someone in finance that Richard got called into a closed-door meeting on Friday, something about policy violations and unnecessary disruption. I nodded slowly. It made sense. The audit email had been the final straw. Someone higher up had started looking, and when they did, they must have found plenty of reasons to get rid of him. His manipulative assignments, his passive-aggressive scheduling tactics, his attempts to strong-arm me into unpaid overtime. It had all been too obvious. And now, he was gone. The rest of the day was almost surreal. No more late meetings, no more forced collaborations designed to punish me. People actually relaxed at their desks as if they had been waiting for permission to breathe again. By 5 p.m., I was packed up and ready to leave. As I walked toward the elevators, Maria caught up with me. So what now? She asked. I smiled, pressing the button. Now? I just keep doing my job. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. Right before they closed, I added, on my terms.